You're listening to Ron Voyage, Journeys with Ron to locations ordinary and exciting by air, land, and sea. I'm your host, Ron Stauffer, just an average American who takes trips from time to time to keep life interesting. In today's episode, I'll be doing something slightly different. Rather than recount one of my own travel experiences, I'll be interviewing someone else who took a trip that I think is absolutely fascinating. This episode is all about a trip my dad took over 30 years ago, where he rode a bicycle across the United States from the West Coast to the East Coast. Riding on a bike for more than 3,000 miles over a period of 42 days and seeing 10 states in the process, it's one of the most ambitious trips undertaken by anybody I know personally. As you listen to this interview, you will probably hear some road noise and dogs barking in the background since our conversation was held outside on the porch at his home near Orlando, Florida. But first, some background on our guest. My dad, who is also named Ron Stauffer, by the way, is one of the most interesting people I know. His life story is filled with variety. He went to college at Cal State Bakersfield in California and earned a bachelor's degree in biology. From there, he decided to go to seminary and get a master's degree in theology. After school, he worked in several diverse industries. He spent nearly 20 years in medical sales, then was a general manager of a construction company, and eventually served a few years as a prison chaplain at a Colorado correctional facility. Finally, he moved to Florida, where he now serves as the lead pastor of a church in Leesburg. I think most people who know my dad think of him as a kind, humble man who is very deep and thoughtful. I also think that many people who meet Pastor Ron would be shocked to learn that the steady, unpretentious guy who faithfully shows up every Sunday morning has accomplished some remarkable journeys in the past that he wouldn't tell you about unless you asked him. Like me, my dad is an explorer, thinker, and traveler who ponders the meaning of life while journeying to new places. He has taken several trips that require sharp mental acuity and physical fitness, including camping in the wilderness in the Carolinas without taking any food or water, backpacking across Europe, spending half a year living in Germany and learning the language, and taking a bike trip across the country, which we'll talk about today. To me, Dad's bike trip has always been something my family talked about, but it seemed more legend than truth. I've never really taken the time to learn about that trip, why he took it, how he prepared for it, or any of the other details. So in today's episode, I finally ask the questions I've always wondered about. If that sounds interesting to you, keep listening. Hi, Dad.
Hey, Ron.
Many years ago, before I was born, you took a trip across the country on a bicycle.
I did.
You spent 42 days riding on a bicycle from the West Coast to the East Coast.
The most unremarkable bicycle.
Unremarkable bicycle. So that was in the year 1980, right?
1980, summer of 1980, yes.
And you started in
in Oceanside, California, dipped my back tire into the water. There was a family strolling along the beach. I asked them to take some pictures with my camera. So we have some pictures of that. And I find it kind of remarkable to look at those pictures nowadays, the pictures from the Pacific Ocean, and then 42 days later, the pictures at the Atlantic Ocean. I think my thighs were twice the size in the Atlantic Ocean because I had put 3,400 miles under my belt by then, and those legs grew, baby.
Okay, so you left on Sunday, June 29th, 1980, and you finished, August
10th.
August 10th, 1980. So
Right.
42 days later. So the first question that comes to mind, why? Why are you doing this? Why are you spending 42 days riding your bike from the West Coast to the East Coast?
Well, I had a strong sense of adventure from some previous adventures that I had done with traveling, some in America and some over in Europe. And there was this Christian conference I wanted to go to in New York City that summer. And I've kind of played around in my mind with different ideas of how to get there and just to really draw, outside the lines, to color outside the lines. So I went back and forth, shall I roller skate, run, walk, skateboard, and I just kind of landed on ride a bicycle. It's faster, it's overland, it's not motorized, and so I did that. Plus, also, I had read this book by Peter Jenkins called A Walk Across America, and man, I admired that guy so much. He thought that he would, walk across America from the East Coast to the West Coast, and said, "Hey, how hard could it be? I'll be done in 6 months, tops." 5 years later, he finished his trip. But he had these great adventures along the way, and that intrigued me. And I thought, I'd like to see America, like not through a windshield, not in an air-conditioned car. And my reasoning was, the more primitive you travel, the closer to the land you get, the closer to the experience you get. I had already had some experience in that with backpacking through Europe the previous year. And so, yeah. Bicycle. Why not?
So you're kind of putting the cart before the horse. It was not that you were this insane cyclist who had done many, many trips on a bicycle and you said the next thing would be riding from the West Coast to the East Coast. It was the opposite. It was you said, I want to make this trip. I guess the bicycle is the best way to do that.
I didn't even own a bicycle. It was like, I don't think I had owned a bicycle for the previous, 7 or 8 years or so.
Okay.
So I just I'm going to ride a bicycle across the United States. I guess I better get a bicycle to do that, right?
It was an unexceptional bicycle. Or what did you say? An unremarkable
Very
bicycle.
Unremarkable.
So you did not go to a bike store and say to a clerk, I want to ride this thing for thousands of miles. Give me the best you got.
Here's how I did it. I just had this picture in my mind of how much money I had and what kind of bicycle I wanted. And I kind of tempered one against the other and reasoned it out. And I thought, I want a bicycle. I don't care how expensive the frame is. Now, frames are really a big deal if you're in the bicycling world. It's a big deal. You can spend thousands of dollars on a frame. But I thought I could do a cheap frame, but I want really good moving parts. So I got on my knees and I just said, Lord, could you find me a bicycle that I can get with a really not so hot frame, as long as it's lightweight, but really good moving parts? And by the way, Lord, I've only got $100 to spend. So long story short, I met up with the guy at work and he had a bicycle for sale. What a coincidence, right?
Sure.
With a cheap kabuki Japanese frame and Campanella derailleurs, Suntour GT Lux brakes, Regita rims. I mean, the best moving parts there were. I asked him, how much do you want for it? He said, I'll take 100. It's like he was listening in on my prayer to God. It was amazing. I added a few extra parts to it there, and I started working out with some buddies from college, and I sucked at riding a bicycle. I was so bad, they left me in the dust. We'd be out riding up these hills, and they'd be 100 yards ahead of me. It's just like, it was embarrassing. I thought I was in good shape. I was in pathetic shape.
So to prepare yourself to ride across the country, you didn't map out a plan and say, for the next 6 months, I'm going to slowly build up my endurance like a marathoner, perhaps.
That would make sense. That would actually be very common sense. No, what I did is I spent about 4 weeks of riding with these other guys 2 or 3 times a week in some early morning workouts. And they taught me how to ride a bicycle, and they taught me how to ride well, and some techniques for building strength and so on. But really, I was at the mercy of I figured I would just get in shape while I was riding on the trip.
So from the first time when you bought that bicycle to when your trip started, how long was that?
Not more than 3 months, probably 2 months.
So, and how many miles do you think you rode on that trip?
I think on the trip I rode about 3,400 miles.
So what before that trip was the longest trip you had ever taken on a bicycle?
30.
So from 30 miles to 3,400 miles.
That.
In 2 or 3 months.
Probably had the longest training run I had done was 30 miles.
So the equivalent of walking around the block and running a marathon with almost no time to train in between.
Yeah, probably something like that.
Okay. So 3,400 miles from the West Coast to the East Coast. How many states was that?
Well, let's see. So California, Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, Oklahoma, Kansas, Missouri, Kentucky, Virginia, 9 states right there. Did I miss one? I'll bet I did.
So, but it was about halfway between north and south, central.
I started out, there was a trail. So back then we didn't have the internet. And so how did you find information? Well, I wonder if somebody's ever mapped out a bicycle route for other people to take. And you just kind of had to go to the library and do your research there. There were no personal computers. There was no World Wide Web. So I figured this out kind of in the springtime of 1980. And somebody had already done the heavy lifting on not developing a trail, but mapping one out that you could ride on and not get yourself killed on the trip. And it was called the Bike Centennial Trail. The idea being, hey, let's get a bunch of bicyclists together and ride across the country in 1976 for a celebration of the bicentennial of the United States of America. And so that was 4 years before I needed it. So I found out about this. I sent in my $25 or whatever to their organization. They sent me back a box full of little booklets that showed, okay, you go through this town and go that town. Kind of like the tour books, Europe. I bet you'll laugh at the price. Back then, when I went to Europe, I took a book with me called Europe on $5 a day. Because you really could do Europe on $5 a day back then if you were really careful. But so I just followed those maps, and there were two basic trails. There was one called the Bike Centennial Trail that started out in Seattle, Washington area, and went all the way across the United States by going down in a southeasterly direction to like Independence, Kansas, and then straight east from there to Virginia. Well, I didn't want to take that northerly route. I already lived in California, so I thought, well, I want to start further south. So they also had another map for something called the Southwest Bicycle Trail. And that went from Southern California across the southern United States and intersected with the Bike Centennial Trail in, I believe it was Independence, Kansas. So I started out on the Southwest Bicycle Trail, took that for, what would that be, 3 weeks or so, maybe 3.5 weeks, and then joined up with the Bike Centennial Trail in Kansas.
So you mapped out your trip ahead of time?
It was kind of mapped out for me. Yes.
And did you say to yourself, I will adhere religiously to this and do everything they say? Or did
Absolutely not. That's not my way. It's a good suggestion. I'll follow it the best I can, I thought. And, sometimes there would be stretches where the map was not accurate. There'd be stretches where the road would be out, or there would be stretches where, well, they built an interstate on that old county highway now. The county highway is gone, and here we are. We just have a 6-lane interstate that doesn't even allow bicycle travel on it. So I did a little of everything. I tried to rarely break the law while I was riding, but sometimes you just got to do what you got to do to get through the day.
Sure. Do you recall where you stayed each night?
I was digging through my stuff today, and I found my diary from this trip. And so do I remember it off the top of my head? There's a lot that I don't remember, but as I was flipping through this diary and reading, it really brought back the memories, and I could start to see the people. Of course, there were some favorite places that I got to stay. My dad worked with Xerox Corporation, and they have a network of offices all across the United States, and especially back then in 1980, it was a really big, popular corporation. They had sales offices everywhere. So my dad offered to call ahead to those different offices roughly along my route and say, hey, I got a boy who's riding his bicycle across the United States from the West Coast to the East Coast. You think you got anybody there who could maybe give him a little hand, give him a place to stay for a night, maybe a meal? And it was a pretty neat deal. I took always a pocket full of coins, and would go to a payphone and call my dad almost every night and say, well, what do you got for me tomorrow? He'd say, well, tomorrow, here's this Xerox business office, and call them, and there's a guy named Roy you want to ask for there. And he said he's got a place for you to stay. Great, Roy.
Oh, wow. So you didn't map out where you had stayed ahead of time. So you would periodically check in with the home base and say...
That's right.
Okay. So Grandpa, your dad,
yes.
my grandpa, also named Ron Stauffer, by the way.
Yes.
Was calling ahead as you were progressing. So maybe he had mapped out a little map himself and said, okay, so 3 days from now, he might be in such and such. So
he was a logistics officer. He had a command post at home with a map of the United States up on the kitchen wall and little pins in it, push pins in it, and names and phone numbers. And it was amazing.
Okay. How much did it cost? A trip like that, 3,400 miles on a bicycle. Did you save thousands of dollars?
That would make sense, wouldn't it? Okay. Save thousands of dollars. You got to understand that what I was going through in my life at that time. I had recently become a Christian on March 17th, 1977. So I had known the Lord about 3.5 years at that point. And I was on a very strong faith journey. Like with the innocence and the faith of a child. And I just believed that God would take care of me along the way. And I believed in my own toughness and resiliency and ability to figure things out. And I believed in my dad, who could help me find places along the way. And I believed in prayer. And I still do, by the way. So this was a really, a strong formational point of my Christian life. And so the whole thing started because I wanted to go to a Christian conference of the church that I had gone to for a couple of years. It was taking place that August in Brooklyn. And I just wanted to go out there. So I came up with this way to travel out there. And I just said to myself, if God wants me to go on this trip, God will provide the means to get there.
So you didn't fundraise and ask people for support?
I had a job at a drugstore, and I saved what I could, but I had spent most of my money on my bicycle and some gear.
Sure.
Bought that bike for $100, put another $50 into it, got some gear for another $50. I think I had $200 into stuff.
Okay.
To do the trip. And then I started out with $82 in my pocket. After a couple of days, I got a traveler's check from my parents, which represented my income tax return, which had come home. I had my dad forge my name to cash my income tax return that was like $100 or so. And he sent me a traveler's check in the mail to one of the Xerox offices. And so there I'm up to $182.
A whopping $182.
Yeah, which would, by the time I got that, I think I was in Texas. So I had made it, from California to Texas on $82. Now that includes my food. I never did once buy a room, but it included whatever food I bought. And really, the most money I spent was on tires and inner tubes.
How many tires and inner tubes did you have to replace?
I never did count it up. I would guess 15 inner tubes maybe, and about 8 tires maybe.
Okay.
Yeah, they weren't cheap. When you're only living on $182 and you got to buy a $20 tire, that's a big deal.
Is that how much it was? Wow.
They were. I don't remember the exact price, but
enough to put a damper in your budget.
It was several days worth of food, put it that way.
Okay. Interesting. Now, you brought up an interesting point. You never paid to stay over on an overnight.
It wasn't in the budget, old chap. It wasn't in the plans.
Okay.
So I had a sleeping bag with me, and I had actually a youth hostel bed sheet from the previous year when I had traveled in Europe. So I had that, and I had a sleeping bag. By the time I got a couple hundred miles into the trip, and it was a hot, hot summer, there was a heat wave going across the United States where every new town that I arrived in, the newspaper headlines in the news racks that day said something like, 6 people killed this weekend in record-setting heat wave. And so this heat wave went before me, and it cooled off just a little bit by the time I would get to each city. So it was spreading from west to east.
You were following the heat wave.
I was following this heat wave. Okay. People were dropping like flies out there. And I'm out there in the middle of the sun riding. So after a couple hundred miles, I said, forget this sleeping bag thing. I finished the trip with nothing but a bed sheet. That was my sleeping gear.
So
and I spent a
no
number
pillow.
of nights outside camping in a sheet. And I sent most of my clothing home. I had, long pants and this and that and the other. By the time I sent all my gear home, I sent this box home. It must have weighed probably 12 pounds that I had been carrying. It had a sleeping bag, a bunch of my clothes, spare pair of shoes and stuff. So I did the trip with one pair of Adidas running shoes, two shorts, two athletic shorts, gym shorts, two pair of underwear, one t-shirt, one long sleeve t-shirt, a bandana, and I think that was it for clothing. That was my clothing. I slept in that. I rode in that. I went to church in that.
Okay.
I'm serious. And this is back when they had those really short shorts for men, like
really short
like
shorts.
really short shorts,
Okay.
right? From 1980. And I'm going into a Southern Baptist church, and all the people going there are like they're dressed up in like, these white shirts and the tight ties and the three-piece suits in the middle of the summer and everything. And I'm coming in a really short pair of gym shorts and some Adidas, and I don't smell that great.
Sure. Okay. So how old were you at the time?
I was 22.
Were you still in school?
I was. So 22. I was on... that should be the year that I would have graduated from college. But because I took a year off college to travel in Europe, what would have been my junior year, and because I slowed down a little bit, I took a semester off to do some work to pay my bills and save some money for school. I got out of school in 6 years instead of 4 years with a bachelor's degree. So I graduated from college at age 24. So yes, so I had 2 more years of school to go before I would graduate.
But this was in the summer, so it didn't affect.
So it was in the summer. It didn't
schooling
affect
at all.
schooling at all. It affected my ability to earn money for school, spending money, not earning it.
How did you afford the time off work? Did you literally tell your boss, I want to take a trip to New York and I need 42 days off, or how did that conversation go?
Yeah, I just went to my boss, Mr. Bruce Clausen at Skaggs Drugstore on Ming Avenue in Bakersfield, California, 93309. And I said, Mr. Clausen, I want to take the summer off. He said, well, I can't do that. And I said, well, I'm going, and I hope I have a job when I come back. And he said, okay, you put it that way, I'll hold your job for you.
Wow.
Yeah.
So, okay, so you had a fan in your, maybe not, a reluctant supporter in your boss.
Right. That's right.
How about the other people you told? Or did you tell people, I'm going to ride my bike all the way across the country?
I told a few people. It's not something that I really wanted to publicize that much. We're to let, the Bible says, let another man's lips praise you and not your own. And I didn't know a whole lot about humility, but I knew it's probably not good to brag about something you haven't done yet. So I didn't want to sort of puff up that adventure before it was accomplished.
Of the few people you told, did anybody say, what? Why?
Not the people who knew me.
Okay.
The people who knew me were just nothing but encouraging because they knew I could do it, because I've basically always accomplished everything I've ever set my mind to. And those who knew that about me just said something along the lines of, yeah, that figures.
We're not surprised.
I'm not surprised you're going to do something like that. I would never do it, but yeah, you can do it.
What about your parents?
Oh, they were all for it.
So you said, I'm going to do this, and they said, okay.
Yeah, absolutely. My dad and my mom were both, they were both all for it. They were very encouraging. They had nothing but faith. They believed in me. Ron, that's what I grew up with, though. Both of my parents always encouraged me, always believed in me, and they would always tell me, Ron, whatever you set your mind to, I believe that you can do it.
And the fact that Grandpa called ahead and got the Xerox crew on board to help you was obviously proof of that.
Yes, he was proud.
He was telling his friends and coworkers and people who worked for the same
That's
company
right.
that he'd never met before.
That's right. That's right. So in a way, the pressure's on, right?
Right. You better not screw it up.
Right.
At some point along your journey, people caught wind of, wow, there's literally a guy on a bicycle riding across the entire country. We should find out about his story. Can you share a couple of examples of that?
Sure. I'm trying to remember the names of some of these towns now, and I'm sure it's in this journal. There was one lady I stayed with, and I don't remember how I met all these people.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes they were Xerox people. Sometimes they were just people that I just met.
Like at a gas station?
Just at a gas...
Filling up
so there's a gas station in Kansas, and I'm on the payphone out in front of the 7-Eleven. Called my dad, and I said, well, Dad, you got anybody for me here in this town? He said, no, I got somebody for you in the next town. I said, okay, great. He asked, where are you going to stay tonight? I said, I don't know where I'm going to stay. I guess I'll look around here for a park or something. But I love you, Dad, and I'll call you tomorrow and let you know that I'm okay. And there was a tall gentleman, handsome fellow in a business suit, and he had just gotten off of another payphone there. And when I hung up the payphone I was on, he said, pardon me for listening in, but I overheard you talking to your father there. I forgot the fellow's name. Let's say his name is Bill Smith. My name's Bill Smith, and I'm the president of one of the two banks here in this town. And my wife is the president of the other bank.
Okay.
And so we're business people here, and we've got a nice place. And I just got off the phone with my wife, and she said, heck yeah, sure, invite that young man over to spend the night with us. So we'd like to adopt you for the night. And so I said, sure.
So the bank president at a city in Kansas that you'd never met overheard your conversation on a payphone and said, my wife has invited you to spend the night at our house.
We'd love to invite you to
come over for
spend
dinner.
the night. Spend a few days if you want. I didn't,
Sure.
They actually took me to their cabin on a lake or something. And we spent the evening swinging off rope swings into the lake and barbecuing outside, and I just enjoyed that. There's all these stories going all across the country. What I learned is that the people of the United States, there's a lot of good people here with really open hearts, and we don't hear about those people enough. They are the salts of the earth, and sometimes you need to open your heart to strangers and accept some help from them, accept their hospitality, and don't be afraid to take a little risk that way. Now, I had sharpened my people judging skills the previous year, backpacking and hitchhiking through Europe, going through countries where I didn't understand the language. And if I got my thumb out and I'm hitchhiking, some guy pulls over and speaks to me in a language I do not understand. I have about 3 seconds to figure out whether this is a good ride or a bad ride. And I don't have any clues from the words being spoken because we don't even speak the same language.
Sure.
You develop some real survival skills that way, real people skills when your life is on the line. And those kind of skills, that kind of streetwise instinct, did me very well in the business world, the world of commerce, the world of sales, and just the street. I learned a lot about humans and human nature, and sometimes I met some people that were questionable, maybe not so honorable, but I found ways to not get into trouble over that.
At some point on your trip, people in the media, radio, newspaper, folks like that, caught wind of what you were doing and thought, hey, this is a good story. I'd like to share it with our public. Weren't you interviewed a couple times?
Was. So word would get around. Maybe somebody would see me riding out on the highway, and I'd be 20, 30 miles outside of a town, and word would but the buzz would start happening in the town there, and they had time to prepare for me to come in. And there was a time a lady came out who was associated with a radio station in Texas, and she offered me a place to stay. She was old enough to be my mom, and I felt pretty safe there. So I got interviewed there on the radio, and then got on my got back into the car then, and went and stayed there, and went to church the next day with that lady, and further, and then one news outlet talks to another, and they read each other's stuff, and then by the time I got to this little town in the panhandle of Texas, Borger, Texas.
Okay.
And I wound up somehow staying with a family there, and they called the local newspaper. The guy came out and interviewed me, took some pictures. It was big excitement. One of those towns where the newspaper comes out once a week, and it's about 6 pages long. Okay, so like this long-haired, young guy and
very short shorts from California.
He's big news, right? Big excitement in town. It's one of those newspapers where they have a whole half of a page dedicated to, well, the Lansings invited the Jennings over for dinner this last Friday night. Had stroganoff, I hear. So it's a big deal. But they're good people.
Sure.
Yeah.
What was it you wanted on this trip? Aside from, okay, I've got a conference to get to in New York, like in what way did you expect that a trip like this would change you or teach you something or shape you? And how did it actually do that?
I think that my expectations of what the trip would do to me and for me were much lower than what the trip actually did for me and to me. I think I had low expectations. I thought it was going to be fun. I thought I would get in shape, and I thought I would get to see America. So it did all those things. I did not realize ahead of time, I could not imagine the impact on my spirit and the impact on my psychology and my faith life that this trip would have. I told you before that I started the trip with $82 in my pocket and 3,000 miles in front of me. I didn't really stop to think that much about what that means.
Sure.
Like, that's a penny a mile or something like crazy like that.
Right.
I wound up leaning on God more than I ever imagined. I wound up needing to trust strangers to a far greater extent than I ever would have thought was reasonable or prudent. And to wake up hours before the sun each day and to see the sun rise in your face, because I'm going east every day, generally along a quiet country road. You're so close to nature. It's a primitive form of travel, and you have 8 to 10 hours a day alone with your mind to think about, why am I here? What is my purpose? And I think it formed a basis for what kind of man I would become. It was much more than just getting big thighs while riding a couple thousand miles and seeing America. The fact that I deliberately took on a challenge that I was almost certain was beyond my ability, this did more to build up my faith in my young Christian years than just about anything else I ever did.
And it sounds like a big part of that was meeting people.
Yes.
That you could never have known ahead of time, that you bumped into at a gas station in Kansas.
And I got to see that regardless of their faith or their ideology or whatever. Everybody is a human being. They all deserve a basic measure of respect, and we need not be afraid of everybody that we meet. I look around today and I see in the news and social media, I see a lot of hatred. I see a lot of mistrust between people. And that goes completely counter to my experience with people riding a bike across the United States. People who are different than me, believe a little bit different than me, they're not my enemy. I can love them and respect them and live with them. Yeah, it was a spiritual thing. Getting to meet different kinds of people. I met people who were amazingly wealthy, and I met people who were really poor, and both were very giving and generous to me, and just poured out their hearts to me. And so I learned that extremely wealthy people are not bad because they're wealthy. They can be absolute salts of the earth, good, godly, wonderful folks. And the same thing with people who are very, very poor. They have as much value as anybody who's really wealthy. And I know we learn that, and we talk about that in Sunday school and in college, and wherever your circle of philosophy is and discussion is. When you get out and you are living in other people's homes, spending the night there, they're cooking for you, they're helping plan your next day's trip. You get to meet their families and their dogs and their, I stayed with people in single wide trailers. I had never slept in a single wide trailer before. I grew up in a upper middle class, fairly prosperous lifestyle. And to go stay, for example, on an Indian reservation where everybody there either lives in an adobe hut or a single wide trailer, they're good people. It was a great experience.
What was the worst part of the trip? Was there a low point?
I don't remember one. I had a few negative experiences, but they didn't qualify to make it a bad trip or a bad day. It's just some negative things that happened, not many, but a few, that is just, that's just something you overcome and you move on. Nothing that ever made me despair or say, oh, this stinks, I don't want to do this.
Okay.
No.
On a more positive note, so we talked about what you learned about America, what you learned about people. What did you learn about yourself? I would imagine 42 days, essentially alone, coming into contact with other people, but essentially alone. You learn something about yourself on a trip like that.
Well, it reinforced in me the conviction and the confidence that, I'll say but I think I mean everybody. If I really set my mind to something, and I'm willing to sacrifice enough, and I'm willing to deal with some difficulties with a good attitude, man, that'll get me through just about anything. Not to be braggadocious, but I think you can accomplish just about anything you really set your mind to if you just decide that's what you're going to do and you're going to pay the price to get there. I'm not saying a person can do anything, but I'm saying if it's really important to you, here's what I learned for me. For me, if something's really important to me and I'm willing to save up some money for it, do a little research about it, and just like launch out and take a risk and try something, pretty good odds that it's going to go well. As long as I stay on top of my attitude about it. I learned that about me. I can pretty much, it's not because I'm special. I think it's within most people. But for me, I learned this about me, that, yeah, I can accomplish almost anything I set my mind to. I don't mean to be the power of positive confession. I'm not into all that. But if you set an athletic goal, a financial goal, an educational goal, and you sacrifice a few things to get there, yeah, you can pull it off. But also I learned This trip enabled me to be alone enough in my own head that I learned that I like it there in my head. It's a good place to be. I like thinking about things. I like deeply contemplating the mysteries of the universe, the nature of God. I think it was the beginning of my journey to becoming an intellectual.
If you haven't heard about Anchor, it's the easiest way to make a podcast. Let me explain. It's free. There are creation tools that allow you to record and edit your podcast right from your phone, iPad, or computer. Anchor will distribute your podcast for you so it can be heard on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and other platforms, and you can make money from your podcast with no minimum listenership. It's everything you need to make a podcast in one place. Download the free Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started. So you're on this trip, 40 plus days, 3,000 plus miles. It's over. It's done. It's the last day. What's going through your mind?
So I remember that I had called my cousin Susie to come pick me up there at Chesapeake Bay at a certain wharf. I was not going to finish the trip until she got there. So, I had spent a couple hours there waiting for her to arrive while I'm looking at the ocean, not completing my trip.
It's so close. It's
so
right
close.
there.
It's so far away. Gave her my camera and said, hey, why don't you take some pictures of me as I ride my bike down into the ocean? It was a little anticlimactic because sounds quaint to say, it wasn't about the destination. It was about the journey. The greatest part of the trip was not arriving at the Atlantic Ocean. That's not the purpose. The purpose was journeying there. And so for me, what I learned out of that, it was a metaphor for life. I mean, it really drove it home to me in a way that I could never have experienced otherwise, probably, which is, an old age retirement with a big house or something like this. If you live your whole life and that's your destination, I'm going to build the dream house and I'm going to, have the wood shop in my garage and do all these things that I can finally, when I have time, I can do all these things and then arrive and you go, maybe not so fulfilling.
Sure.
And you look back on your life, because I'm getting closer to retirement age now. You look back on your life and where's the real joy? It was in the hardships of being a 35-year-old father, trying to bring home the groceries. And you get through these hard things in your life and you forge relationships and love and family and friendships and you suffer. And those are the good things of life, not going through the suffering, but coming out on the other side. And so when I finished this bicycle journey, a little over 3,000 miles, 6 weeks, it was good to finish it, but it wasn't the high point of my life. And that was a real, I won't say it was a real letdown, but it was a real aha moment for me. Like, thinking, I should be happier than this. This should be a bigger deal for me. I should be just like jumping out of my skin to be here at the destination. And I wasn't. It wasn't a letdown, but it was a pretty cool moment.
But it wasn't the high point.
It was not the high point of the trip. And there wasn't any one real high point of the trip where I could say, like, oh man, this was the best day right here.
Okay.
I suppose the last day of the trip was a high point of the trip in the sense that I could look back and on a lot of experiences gained that made me who I am today. And at that point, more than any other point in that 3,000-mile journey, then I could really appreciate it. Look what I have done. Look what I have come through. Look what God has done for me in all this. I'm closer to God. I know more about myself. I value my parents more than I ever did. I value family. I value the people of these United States. They're great, good people.
Mm-hmm.
This has been a great adventure. I'm sorry it's over.
So less about being happy that it's over and saying, I did it, it's done, and more about maybe you felt more like, I'm a little bit sad that it's done.
I was a little bit sad that it's done.
Yeah.
But from that sadness came a determination, Ron, that I want to keep doing this. Not a bicycle trip, not big high adventure, but a determination that I want to keep experiencing every day to the and squeeze the maximum out of it that I can, and be open to those little things, like these little experiences that make the day. Like when that snake slithers across the road that you're traveling on your bicycle in Arizona in the high desert. And you get off your bicycle, I get off my bicycle and I look at that snake and I prod it with a stick, and maybe I pick it up and play with it and go, this is a gorgeous snake. Praise God. What beautiful nature this is. Or to see I remember seeing a reservoir in New Mexico. Oh my goodness, got to be the driest state in the U.S. New Mexico is a dry state. And I came to this in the middle of this just dry cactus desert. There's this big reservoir. And I got out and I went swimming. I don't think you were supposed to, but I did. And I realized, wow, water's a beautiful thing. And to be able to, cool off on a 105-degree day in a New Mexico desert in this pool, and just these little tiny things, that add up to where you say, man, I said, in the rest of my life, I never want to lose sight of the joy in the little things in the middle of the day when I least expect them. Part of my philosophy of kind of going through life is, if I'm traveling, if I'm going somewhere, if I'm doing something, and there's an opportunity to see something cool or to do something fun along the way, stop. Take the time, go experience the thing. Okay. And put it in your portfolio of things that you've done now. And for me, part of the joy of life is building this portfolio of memories and experiences of, I did this thing in Puerto Rico. I did this thing in Germany. I did this thing in Arizona. And not to get a notch on your belt, well, look at me, what a great, list of things. But just they start to form who you are. Sure. As a person. So I encourage anybody, especially anybody in the Stauffer family, if you have the opportunity to do something cool, something that makes you a little uncomfortable, makes you stretch a little, costs you a little money, just do it. Then nobody can ever take that experience away from you. Right. And you will be a richer person because of it.
That's great. That's very much in line with what I try to focus on in this podcast, which is travel the world, explore, and you will be changed in the process. You will learn things. You will be a better person for it. Travel is painful. You get sunburn on your legs. You get blisters. You say, this hurts. It's hard. It's difficult. Why am I doing this? And you go home a better person, and you love your wife more, and you're more thankful for your kids.
Which is why in 1987, when I took my wife, your mom, behind the Iron Curtain in communist Eastern Europe to Czechoslovakia and Hungary. I was having a great time because I was stretching myself beyond my comfort zone. And isn't this great? Look at all this oppression and there were Soviet army people there and tanks.
And she hated every minute of it.
She hated it. And I was going like, look how great this is, honey. We're behind the Iron Curtain.
Oh, it's great. Okay, so in closing, it sounds like this was the most transformative experience of your life before getting married.
This trip on the bicycle was probably the most transformative experience of my life before getting married. But there's one more that rivals it, and that is Outward Bound in North Carolina. Especially the solo experience of sitting 4 days and 3 nights under a tree by myself, not eating food or drinking water, but only with my Gideon New Testament and my journal. Yes, Outward Bound as a 17-year-old, it taught me that there's things out there that I'm being pulled towards that are both scary and attractive to me. And I have no idea where I'm going to end up. And I have no idea how I'm going to get there. And I have no idea what I'm going to do with my life. But it's going to be an adventure, and somehow it involves God.
Okay, so what would you tell somebody else, a 22-year-old man who comes to you and says, hey, I want to ride my bike across the U.S.? Would you just not tell him anything and let him learn it on his own, or would you give him very specific guidance about?
Yeah, no, I would only want to encourage a guy like that. But I think before you launch out on something that is really out there, to at least some extent, you should know yourself. Like, this whole business of going out, on these fantastic journeys or whatever to find yourself, I think you should have a concept of who you are first before you go out to quote unquote find yourself. I think it's dangerous to go out into the world, especially today. It's a more dangerous world today, I believe. I think it's dangerous to go out without some kind of self-awareness, self-knowledge. There's a level of I had a pretty high level of maturity going out there. If I saw a young person who was really immature and naive, I would discourage them from this trip. I would only want to see somebody go on a trip that involves some risk. If they have common sense, self-awareness, are a fair judge of people, because you're going to be putting yourself in a vulnerable place out there. So you should have some skills in judging the character of other people. I would also encourage a higher level of danger awareness than what I exercised. I think some situations I got through by the grace of God.
Okay.
Yeah.
If you had this trip to do over, there's at least one or two things that you would do differently that you've mentioned. What are those final thoughts where you say, I would do this a little bit differently?
I would stop a little more often. If I could do anything differently about the trip, I think I would stop a little more often and experience a few more things. I made the trip pretty athletic. So to keep up a 92-mile-a-day pace, for me, that was a pretty blistering pace. It's a lot of miles. And, without any support, didn't have a support vehicle or anything. So you're carrying everything by yourself. And I think I would do fewer miles per day, probably closer to 70 than 90.
Okay.
And I think that would be more enjoyable. Get a little more sleep. Although, I was 22, so what the heck, maybe that was okay back then. But I remember even thinking back then, I think I would do it slower next time. So instead of 42 days, maybe make it 50 days or 55 days or something.
Okay.
And I really did enjoy taking a 0 day once in a while, stopping and just hanging out, doing something fun.
Do you have any final highlights on a 0 day, like things that you might have done when you weren't on your bike?
I did just hang out in Borger, Texas with that family. I really enjoyed them so much. And I just took my bicycle apart piece by piece, and I just polished up every piece of it with a toothbrush and some Comet cleanser, and put it back together.
Okay.
It was just contemplative, restful.
Just pause.
Just talking with some good old Southern people and enjoying some good food. Man, I must have eaten every scrap of food they had on their table. One thing about a trip like this is like, I normally just eat like a bird. I don't eat that much. My goodness, I couldn't shovel enough food in my mouth on this trip. I think I calculated I was consuming about at least 6,000 calories a day. That's a lot of calories. Okay. So like I found myself in the position of sitting at a table and asking everybody, you going to eat those mashed potatoes? Here, I'll eat them.
Because really you burn it all off the next day, kind of,
right? Some of the high points were really just sitting down, taking a day with a family and enjoying it. There was this one lady, I forgot her name, in the mountains, in the coal mining towns, some coal mining town in Kentucky.
Okay.
Man, I just enjoyed staying with her. She was really old and she was in a wheelchair. And it was like this little house. I don't think even there was electricity in that house. It was like kerosene lanterns or something, and she got up at like 3:30 in the morning. She was frying chicken for me for my breakfast, and it was just cool. And I just about died that day with coal trucks knocking me off the stinking road. But it was really cool to stay with the just kind of hillbilly folks there. It was neat.
Nice people.
Good people.
Yeah.
Good folks.
Thanks for being here today, Dad.
Thanks for having me.
It's been fun.
It has been good. Appreciate the interview. I learned a lot about myself tonight.
That's the goal. All right. Thanks for listening. You've been listening to Ron Voyage, journeys with Ron to locations ordinary and exciting by air, land, and sea. This podcast is written and produced by me, your host, Ron Stauffer. If you found this episode interesting or helpful, tell me. Send an email to feedback@ronvoyage.com and let me know. To read more about my journeys or view accompanying maps, videos, graphics, or photographs, visit ronvoyage.com. Thanks for listening.